First of all, why does complexity imply something built it? Like, if something built it, then what built the, how did that thing get so complicated? When you pay that much attention to something, then, poof, magically, an experience comes out, right? And so It's missing a piece. It's got that so-called explanatory gap. The thing people refer to as consciousness is very tightly bound to a self model, right? It's something we say we have. It's something we intuitively believe we have. And the reason is because
welcome to the Quantum Theory Podcast. Well, thank you, Michael, for so much for joining us here on the Quantum Theory Podcast. And I'm looking forward to diving into all sorts of aspects of attention schema theory and really your general theories of consciousness. But to kind of start things off here, I'll give you a bit of a softball question to get into things here. And that is, what is consciousness?
Right. Oh, the softball question. Right. Obviously, lots of different people have different notions of what that word means and what it should refer to. I think most scholars, most people who study it today, consider the word to refer to experience, subjective experience. And so by that, I mean consciousness. In this view, consciousness is not all the stuff going on in your head. It's not your knowledge of yourself. It's not your memories. It's not the ability to choose and make decisions. Consciousness is very specifically the fact that sometimes those things feel like something when you're doing them, right? And so there's a lot of stuff going on in the brain that doesn't feel like anything. Regulation of this and that and regulation of your heart rate and processing 90% of the sensory input coming in you don't know about, and it feels like nothing. There's nothing it feels like to do those things. But there's this tiny subset where you can feel what it's like to do them, feel what it's like to see the color green, and feel what it's like to get poked with a pin, and feel what it's like to try to remember something from yesterday. That's consciousness, the subjective feel itself. That's how most scholars think of it.
Understood. I think that's a great segue into kind of kicking things off with attention schema theory, and really just getting a basics of the understanding of just kind of the nuts and bolts of that. Because from my understanding, really it centers around just attention ultimately.
That's right. So one of the things we know about the brain, the mammalian brain, but especially the human brain, because most of the research has been done on the human brain on this topic. So there's this thing called attention, and everyone kind of uses that word, and we all kind of vaguely know what it means. But with respect to neuroscience, attention, there's lots of different kinds of attention, but there's the main kind of attention is this mechanism mostly in our cerebral cortex. And it's a way of focusing on a small number of items. Whatever those are, it could be external, it could be internal, it could be memories, or it could be your emotions, or it could be sights and sounds, but you focus on a very small number, you process them in great detail, and as a result, your brain is able to make intelligent decisions and control behavior. And so that's attention. And attention is this very interesting thing, but it's also a very mechanistic thing. And people have even built, attention-like artificial systems. So it's understood well enough to at least begin to imitate artificially. That's attention. And there's a really interesting relationship between attention and consciousness. And the relationship is that they almost always come together. So what you pay attention to, you're almost always conscious of. And what you're not paying attention to, you're typically not conscious of. And that's called inattentional blindness. So attention and consciousness almost always co-vary. They almost always move around together. Not 100% of the time, actually. You can split them apart a little bit in laboratory situations, but most of the time they go together. And so that's a huge hint, I think, and many people think about consciousness as this really specific relationship to attention and things creatures that don't have that kind of attention probably don't have our kind of consciousness.
Sure. And I recall you mentioning as well, it's similar to the global workspace theory in the sense that it follows a similar pathway. You get the information input and it goes through, I guess, intense competition, and there's inhibition and promotion of certain signals, and it makes its way up to the parietal frontal networks where it then can eventually enter your consciousness, quote unquote. And I'm curious to kind of understand your perspective on the idea that, would you say that if consciousness is based on attention, or more specifically, this attention schema network, our ability to be conscious of our ability to pay attention to different things and have control over that, would you say that we are one with the attention schema? Would that be that the house of consciousness, or is there a separation between sort of who we are or what we are and that mechanism? Does that question make sense?
Well, I don't know. So we are literally a collection of a very large number of different processes that interact with each other. And so, that's like literally what we are. Like, that's what the brain is. And it's not one thing, and it's built, not a billion, but lots of different mechanisms all interacting in different ways. And of course also a body, and it's all integrated together. That's literally what we are. That's of course separate from what we think of we are, right? Because everyone has a self concept and a self model, basically. And our self models tend to be very simplified, and we think of ourselves as kind of a conscious entity floating inside of ourselves that knows things and makes decisions, and like the puppeteer, that's how we think of ourselves. And that's us. That's not accurate in the slightest bit, but it's a useful way for the brain to understand itself and keep track of itself, right? So there's who we are, and then there's the self model, who we intuitively think we are. And those are really different things. And so, yes, I would say the thing people refer to as consciousness is very tightly bound to a self model, right? It's something we say we have. It's something we intuitively believe we have. And the reason is because our brain has built that kind of self-description. And it's not a terribly accurate self-description, but it's useful. It's got some validity to it. It's just, in its details, not terribly accurate.
Got it. So is there a mechanism or a certain way that you can pinpoint that process happens, of that self-informing of itself? Because it just from the outside in, it sounds like there's something that is aware of this ability, or this attention model, if you will. What's kind of the relationship there?
So just to sort of lay down a few more basics.
Sure.
So one of the things that we've already mentioned quite a bit in just this brief part of the conversation, one of the things the brain does, one of the main things the brain does, is build models. And there's lots of different vocabulary around that. And some people talk about representations, and some people talk about prediction or predictive models, and so on and so on. What the brain does is build models, and models are basically bundles of information that represent things in the world. And they don't just depict things, they also make predictions about things. And so we have models of everything around us that we know about. In fact, if you know about it, then your brain has a model of it. Because if there's no model in there, then you can't even think about it. It doesn't enter your cognition. You can't talk about it, right? So even looking around yourself and you see your coffee cup, your visual system built a model of the coffee cup. And the model is information about color and shape and location and so on. And it's on the basis of that model sending information to higher cognition that allows you to say, there's a coffee cup, and to think about it and talk about it. So whatever is built into these models, we think about, know about, and talk about. Whatever is not represented by a model, irrelevant to our minds, doesn't exist as far as we're concerned, because it's not being processed, not there, right? So now we have this, so that's a baseline. So now we have this very special, weird item that people talk about, that they intuitively know they have, that they think they have, that they believe they have. And that is conscious experience, right? And people can say, well, I don't just know there's a coffee cup. I have a conscious experience of it. I don't just, in some weird abstract sense, like a computer, have the information that, that my foot is itching.
Right.
I experience the itch, right? So people talk about having that experience. That's the essence. That's the heart of the consciousness mystery, that people say, believe, intuitively understand that they have this experience, this conscious experience. But the problem is, logically, what that means is, therefore, the brain has built a model. And the model says there's a thing that is experienceness, and you're having it right now. And if you didn't have that model, then you would never even know or think that you had that. So the brain has built a model. What is it a model of? Like, what is the thing that's being modeled, right? So that's where the attention schema comes in. It says, well, attention is the real thing. Attention is this mechanism for the brain to focus on deeply process some things to the exclusion of other things, like deeply process the coffee cup, deeply process the itch on your foot. That's attention. Then there's a model of attention. A model says, essentially, I have an experience of that thing, right? And what the model's really doing is, in a cartoon way or a simplified way, trying to depict the state of attention, right? So it's like, attention is the first order. Then there's this other thing, which is kind of like attention on attention, or a representation of attention, a model of attention. And that's the necessary step that so many theories, I think, are missing. That's the necessary step. You have to stick in there. You have to have that piece stuck in the machine. Otherwise, you cannot explain why people go around being so certain at an intuitive level, certain that they have experience, subjective experience. So that's a little piece of the machine you need in there.
Sure. And I recall you mentioning that in relation to what potentially global workspace theory was missing, because otherwise it would just be sort of information input, but there wouldn't be a register of the experience. If I have that correct.
That's right. So global workspace theory, in a sense, is an attention theory. And that's really what the global workspace is. It says if you pay enough attention to something, it gets so boosted in signal strength that it enters a state of like super, influence over the brain. That's just the peak of attention, like the peak of the pyramid of attention. Attention, you can pay a little bit of attention and boost signals a little bit, but then they get boosted enough and they reach the peak of that pyramid and they start influencing, the brain. I think Dan Dennett coined the phrase, fame in the brain.
Right.
Right. So that's really paying attention to something. That's the global workspace theory. And it says essentially, when you pay that much attention to something, then poof, magically an experience comes out. Right. And so It's missing a piece. It's got that so-called explanatory gap. And what the attention schema theory says is, this is great. It's all great so far. Global workspace theory, marvelous so far, but you got to fill that gap. And people can't think, believe, or claim they have conscious experiences unless something in there has built a model that depicts what conscious experience is, what is experienceness, and then tells you that you're having it. So there's this little hidden piece of the machinery that most theories tend to gloss over or forget. And the attention schema theory basically focuses on that extra little piece and says, no, whatever theory you have is great, but you got to have that extra piece in there. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
Sure. And it's interesting because that is almost the substitute for what spiritual traditions would call the observer. It seems like that is directly analogous to the attention schema. It's what's aware of the attention, right? It seems kind of to be one and the same in sort of a analogous sense. If you would. Mm-hmm.
Sort of. Yeah. But it may be even more subtle than that. Because attention is in some ways like the observer, right? The machine is paying attention to this thing and is paying attention to that thing. But if that's all you have, then the machine doesn't know what attention is. Like, it's observing the coffee cup, it's observing the itch, but it's not observing itself observing. Right?
Right.
That's the piece that the attention schema adds. Is this is a machine that knows what observation is, that knows what attention is, and it codes it in this particular way.
Right. Yeah, that seems to be a very direct parallel. It's very interesting to hear a very neuroscientific explanation for that, because logically, I mean, that does make a ton of sense. I think the one thing that still perplexes me, and I know many people listening that are likely maybe a bit more conscious centric in their beliefs, or maybe even spiritual as well, is it's always going to come down to, where does the qualia come from? And because you can have attention all day, you can have an attention schema all day and have a model that informs itself of its experience. But and I recall, if I have this correctly as well in your book, you're saying that because it's more of a cartoonish depiction, and because these models don't benefit from knowing every detail. When you're hitting a hammer to a nail, you don't think about your elbow position and your shoulder, and most times it's different every hit as you were citing. It's about just generally achieving the goal and not focusing on all the mechanistic little parts of that. So I recall that sort of answer as well, but do you think that we'll ever get a mechanism for how this model informs itself of the awe of a sunset, or the mother, the first glance at their newborn child? Is that something that can be reduced to something as simple as a model?
Well, so two answers to that. First, I want to talk about emotion, because the particular examples you gave all tap into emotion, right? And that's something that often comes up when people talk about consciousness, and they want to distinguish between the things that are more understood computationally and the things that are still mysterious. And there's a tendency then to say, yeah, but what about emotionality? The mother's feeling toward the child, or the awe of the sunset, or the feeling of love, or whatever. People tend to point that direction. And that's very convenient, because nobody actually understands emotion. Like,
sure.
This is a system, this is a system in the brain that's not really, like, some of the wiring has been worked out in a little bit here and there, but it's one of the least understood aspects of brain function or mind or anything. And so that makes it really easy to point to that and say consciousness is a mystery. I guess I would say that's mixing up consciousness with the thing of which you are conscious. Like, those are two different things. So you can have, so I'm going to make an assertion here, which may sound really weird, but turns out to be true and well established in psychology. You can have emotions and not be conscious of them. So you can have anger and not have a conscious experience of having anger. And it's really hard for people to understand that, because if you're not having a conscious experience of it, then you don't know it, and it's not, and you're like, that's not happening. And so, but it turns out that is true, and it happens frequently, and that's why you need a therapist to sit down and tell you,
Right.
Dude, you're really angry today, and let me prove it to you. And then you're like, oh my gosh, you're right. I was angry. I didn't even know it. And some people are more susceptible to that than others. So emotionality, awe, love, anger, whatever, these are somehow products of the brain. Nobody knows why or how. They just are. But then there are some cases when you pay attention to them, and then you have a conscious experience of it. Right? And those are limited instances. So probably most of the emotions you have, you're not even conscious of. But you become conscious of them when you pay attention to them. And so once again, consciousness, the experience itself, is not, we may not understand the mechanism of emotion, but we can understand the mechanism of attention and how you get the experience, the experiential side. It's the same thing for emotion, same thing for vision. Well, more is known about how vision processes information, but to process color and shape and so on is not the same thing as having a conscious experience of it. That's a separate mechanism, right? To do that, then you need this mechanism of attention to pay attention to something in specific, focus on that one part of the visual world. And then you have these other things like the attention schema mechanism coming in. So I would draw this distinction then between all the mysteries of the specific things that we can be conscious of versus the more universal mechanism that cuts across all domains. It's the mechanism of how we get to have a conscious experience of them. And that universal mechanism, I think, is much simpler. And I think a lot of it, frankly, is already, at least in general, the general outlines of it can be seen. Like we begin to understand it.
Wow. I'd love to further kind of trace back, get some sort of lineage behind this mechanism, some backdrop, sort of from an evolutionary standpoint. One thing I find fascinating as well about your theory is it's not a complexity theory where the more neurons, the more, complex, et cetera, is the more consciousness. And as you said, you can slide up and down the slippery slope, which I thought was funny as well. Because usually more mechanistic theories of consciousness kind of, I feel at least, come from a complexity angle, but your perspective is, hey, there are others and likely others that have consciousness as you would define it, because it comes from this attention schema network. So I'd love to get kind of an idea of, where this came from, and maybe even potentially other life forms that you perceive could even have this consciousness, if you will.
Yeah, sure. So that's obviously a huge topic. Lots and lots of people speculate about who's conscious and who isn't. And in the world of consciousness studies, like the world of people who are serious about it, there's actually a huge range of opinions, all the way from those who are panpsychists. And they're the guys saying everything is conscious, like every bit of everything, and your fingernails are conscious and rocks and stuff, which to me makes the word lose all meaning. All the way up to the people who will say, no, not only are humans the only things that are conscious, but only adult humans are conscious. And babies aren't, and children aren't, and you have to learn it. So there's the really, and I don't believe that side of it either. So a really interesting mix of opinions. In the approach that I've taken, so this attention schema approach, the key is the relationship between consciousness and attention, what's called selective attention. And that kind of attention exists only in some kinds of animals. And so now you can begin to look in evolutionary terms, and you see this particular kind of attention emerging and really becoming elaborated in animals that have a cortex, or basically equivalent of cortex. So we have this big cerebral cortex, we're primates, but all mammals have that. Birds have an equivalent of it. And reptiles, we all evolved from reptiles. Birds and mammals kind of branched off from different types of reptile-like animals. And so birds, mammals, and probably some reptiles definitely have these mechanisms of attention. I think other animals that don't have that don't have what we call consciousness. It's very hard for people to accept, because they look at animals. There's a lot of talk about insects these days, for example, like bees are very, very wonderfully complicated animals, and they compute information and they interact socially and they do all kinds of things. They're amazing things. That does not mean that they have this conscious experiential kind of thing as we report it. There's lots of machines in the world that are unbelievably complicated, but aren't built with that particular set of modules, right? And I don't think that they have the attention mechanisms in the same way. And so that, evolutionarily speaking, I would say we're looking like a couple 100 million years ago at the branch point between, mammal-like reptiles turned into us eventually, and the other kind evolve into dinosaurs and thus into birds. And it's all that kind of part of the branching tree that has this really elaborated attention mechanism that leads to what we're calling consciousness.
Wow. Yeah, it's so interesting to kind of hear not only that, but also kind of your perspective too on panpsychism. I think my question in regards to that is, I know there's some I think theories of panpsychism that don't necessarily say that maybe physical matter is conscious, but let's say that there is a field of consciousness. And I don't know how much time you spend thinking about more of like the quantum physical or cosmological side of things, but I kind of want to also pick your brain on a complementary topic, which was sort of non-local consciousness, given kind of developments in quantum physics like entanglement, or even, holographic reality theory, where we're kind of understanding that the universe itself is sort of fractal information patterns that, perhaps guide behavior at atomic to even cosmic levels. And we're kind of in this information field. And we, of course, are connected in part of that. Do you spend much time thinking about that? Do you find any merit in those types of thought processes?
No.
I assumed I know the answer to that question.
So I have a background in physics, and I studied physics as an undergrad. I was a physics major, and one of my favorite topics was quantum mechanics, and so I studied all this stuff. I don't believe that any of that makes any sense. I think that's the people who pursue that are not pursuing. I think I know what a physics theory is. And physics theories are beautiful and elegant and mathematically precise, and they address really specific measurable quantities. And then there's weird fluff that builds on top of them because, quantum mechanics is mysterious and consciousness is mysterious. So it must be that they're the same thing. I don't know what the issue is there, but there's a lot of quantum mush. I'm very much reminded of, I used to love, well, I still love Star Trek. I don't know. I don't watch, it's been ages. But there's kind of a running joke in Star Trek that whenever they ran into anything complicated, they would use technobabble. And they had special technobabble authors who were experts on that. And they would write a script, and then the technobabble authors would have to come in and fill in the technobabble. And it was always quantum. It was like the quantum field matrix is breaking down into the quantum submodalities. And that's basically what quantum consciousness is. It's this totally stupid technobabble that's getting in the way of the science. The heart of the problem, I think, is we have an intuitive understanding of what this consciousness thing is. That intuitive understanding emerges out of like I said, the models that the brain builds. Like, that's why we think the things we think, believe the things we believe, because it derives from these deep models constructed in the brain. The models are not accurate. One cannot take them at face value. They're really interesting. They probably point to real things that are being represented by the brain, but one cannot take them literally accurately. And when you do, you run into trouble. And so when people say, how do we explain how we get energy like invisible essence inside our heads that experiences and controls, then you're in trouble. Because that's the intuitive understanding of it, and the intuitive understanding is not an accurate depiction of it. It just isn't. So I'll give you an example that I often give that I have found useful lately, especially. And that's the example of the phantom limb. I forget whether I ended up putting that in that particular book.
Yeah, you did.
Okay, all right. So here's how the phantom limb works. Let's say I get my arm amputated. Hope I don't. But if I do, chances are very good, like 95%, that I'm going to have a phantom experience. And then it might fade rapidly, and for some people it lingers for years, but I get a phantom limb, meaning it feels like there's a limb still there. And if I close my eyes, I can describe it, and people can ask me, oh my God, what's it like? And I can say, it's got 5 fingers, and it's just like my arm was, and it's so on and so on. I can describe it, depict it, right? Now there's 2, and they're very common phantom limbs. So, and they're very annoying because a phantom limb can itch, and then you can't scratch it. And it can hurt, and you can't anesthetize it. And it can be horribly painful, and you can't go to a doctor and have them fix your phantom limb because it's not there, right? So there's so they're a medical issue, but there's two classes of explanations of phantom limbs, and I'm going to call one the schema theory because it's a direct relationship to, the attention schema theory of consciousness. And it's a schema theory. And the other I'm going to call the hard problem explanation. It's a direct reference to the kind of more magicalist hard problem theories of consciousness, right? So the schema theory goes like this. The reason why I think I have this limb here is because my brain has built a model of a limb. The model's no longer accurate because my real limb is gone, it got amputated, but the model is still there. And the brain has built the schema, the schematic model that depicts a limb, and therefore that model is informing the rest of my brain, and therefore if someone asks me, I can start describing that limb and say, yeah, I can feel it there, and it's got fingers and so on. And all that report and all that belief derives from a model, a depiction of a limb. That's schema theory. That's one way to explain it. The other way to explain it is to say, there's actually an invisible limb, an energy field growing out of my stump. It's really there. And now we have some problems. We have three hard problems that are basically unsolvable. One is, how did it grow? Like, what's the mechanism? Like, are there weird little things at the base of the stump that make the energy limb grow? Like, what's the recipe that makes the invisible arm grow? And the second problem is, what's it made out of? Is it like quantum mist? Or is it reverberation or something else? Like, what is the invisible arm made out of? And the third problem, which is one nobody ever addresses, is once it's there, once you have the invisible arm, how is energy like weird invisible arm? How does it specifically affect neurons in my brain in just the right way that I know it's there and can talk about it and tell you about it, right? So those are three hard problems that have no apparent solution. And they come about from the mistake of thinking that when I introspect and gain access to these intuitive models, the mistake is thinking the models are literally accurate. And they're not. And that's what one has to do here, is say, these models are not literally accurate. They have information in them that lead us to make these claims and have these beliefs. The models are not literally accurate. So it's exactly the same thing with consciousness. You can say the models built in the brain, that's why we say we have these magical energy-like essences of experience inside of us. But that intuitive belief emerges from information models, representations in the brain. Or you can say, you actually have the energy-like essences in there. Now we're stuck with a whole bunch of unsolvable problems and endless arguments and debates back and forth, and the common refrain, no one will ever understand consciousness. And those are kind of the two sides of the divide. On one side, on schema theory, the solution's essentially already there. And on the other side, the more hard problem magicalist side, you made a mistake at the very outset by assuming something is real when it isn't. Or rather, assuming something is literally accurate when it's not literally accurate. And now you're stuck. Now you'll never solve it.
This reminds me a lot of synesthesia. Do you do any work or with synesthesia? Are you familiar with that, where you kind of have phantom, three-dimensional objects or confusing different senses for other senses? It kind of reminds me of that a little bit.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think it's all part of the same point, that the thing we think of, each one of us thinks that we live in a reality. And we take that reality for granted. We think this is it. This is the real world. But what's really happening is our brains are constructing that. I mean, I keep using the word model. That's what's happening. The brain is building a model of reality. And whatever the model says, that's what your reality is. And so synesthesia is another example where the brain has constructed something that's a little weird, a little non-standard. But for those people, that's reality. For those people, I mean, if you're a synesthete, very often numbers have colors.
Right.
It's just what it is. And other people don't get that. You can never get that unless you're a synesthete. And there's other examples of synesthesia. And you can spend forever. Like the hard problem of that kind of synesthesia is, how does the number 9 get the color green? Like, what is it about 9-ness in the universe that makes greenness appear? Right. And that would be the magic explanation that assumes it to be literally accurate. And then the schema explanation would be, well, the brain built a schema and the schema is not accurate. And it's saying something that's not fully coherent. But because it's saying that, then that's what the whole rest of the brain is going to think.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. And to also kind of double onto this kind of point here is, I'd love to hear your perspective on meditation. I think it's interesting because, with this theory of consciousness, it's attention and it's our awareness of our attention. I think the foundation of meditation is like the exact opposite. It's where you are becoming nobody with no thoughts and no time, and you're just becoming a pure essence of awareness, or whatever you want to call it. You are just in a state of existence, nothing more and nothing less. And I've even seen studies personally where it even increases cortical thickness, people that meditate a ton and have practiced it. But how can one be conscious, but yet in the definition of attention, not be paying, or be paying nearly to zero attention, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So we're very interested. My whole lab is very interested in meditation.
Very cool.
Yeah. And we study it. We've stuck people in scanners and just try to understand what, many people have done this. What are the networks and what can you deduce about what's going on during meditation? And one kind of meditation, so there's lots of different kinds, but one kind that really interests us is focused attention meditation. But I would say no matter what kind of attention you're doing, it's not that you're taking all attention away. Or it's not that you're shrinking your attention to this one mantra. It's that you're controlling your attention. This is always the key to meditation, is hyper control of your attention. And so one of the mechanism, the whole use of having an attention mechanism is to control attention, right? So attention controls behavior, because what you pay attention to drives your behavior. And if you want to control your own behavior, you got to control your attention. And
right.
If it's as simple as making a sandwich, a peanut butter sandwich, you still have to make your attention move to the peanut butter jar, and then move to the bread, and then move to the knife, and so on. You have to control where your attention is going. So volition and everything we do depends on high-level control of attention. So one of the biggest challenges in control of attention is not so much getting your attention on something, but keeping it away from everything else that's pulling on it, right? So I think meditation is at its root about control of attention. And the people who put themselves in a state of kind of seeming nothingness, what they're really doing is saying, I have learned to pull my attention away from all the distractions. Maybe I'm focusing just on the fact that I'm here and nothing else, but I can still control my attention. And there's other people who have mantras and they focus on that, or people who focus on their breathing, and that becomes the singular thing that all their attention is focused on. So it's always about attention. It's not a lack of attention. And what interests us about meditation and expert meditators, we think this whole mechanism of attention control is getting beefed up. They're getting better at it. They're getting better at controlling their own attention. And in this attention schema theory, that essentially means they're beefing up that whole consciousness mechanism. Almost like an athlete or a dancer. A dancer's probably a better example. Dancers learn to focus on body postures and limb positions and imagine them, and they beef up their internal models of their bodies and their body postures, to the point that they can even practice dancing just in their own minds without moving their bodies. And they can actually get better by really imagining. They have amazingly beefed up body schemas,
Wow.
representations of their bodies. And I think meditators are basically beefing up their attention schemas,
Wow.
their models, their understanding of what their attention is doing at any one moment. So I think there's a really deep connection actually between meditation and an attention and attention schemas.
I love that. I love thinking of it similar to an athlete would think of their body and getting their physical awareness and their physical proficiency. Meditation's like the gym for your attention.
Yeah.
And I think if people realize that, I think more people would see it more as like a practical practice for them and for their productivity and their goals or whatever it might be, versus something that is just, kind of like, like a woo woo, sit cross-legged and, breathe to some mantras. I think it's so cool that, neuroscientists, even like yourselves, are finding some serious positive benefit, especially for attention, by doing those practices. I'm curious as well, just because you guys are on this right now, what would you say is like one of the number one or top couple most interesting things you've learned about meditation when it comes to the mind?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that. Probably, unfortunately, when you study these things scientifically, you tend to focus in on little teeny mechanistic questions that are addressable. And so
Sure.
the things that we tend to learn about are networks in the brain that seem to light up at different phases of meditation. And to me, of course, that's terribly interesting. I want to know that the default mode network is really active in some moments and less so in others. I want to know that, so for example, mind wandering is one of the things we study. So when people try to meditate and focus on one thing, and then all of a sudden they realize, oops, my mind wandered. I was thinking about my taxes. And then they yank their mind back. There's this moment of conscious realization. And that particular moment seems to involve activation of a certain set of structures in the brain. And that's completely fascinating to us. So those are the kinds of things that we tend to learn about a meditation, which are probably less practically applicable.
No, that's so cool. I mean, I think that's still connected to just the major sort of blanket of what is consciousness. Even what are the things that bring your attention back to focus, and what are those networks? That's absolutely fascinating. I'd like to kind of even switch gears here a little bit too, towards even the realm of social cognition, and kind of go into the world of theory of mind, if you don't mind giving us just some general context there.
Yeah, sure. So, absolutely. One of the things that people in my lab realized quite a long time ago is that when you talk about consciousness, especially in people, it is way more than just the private stuff in your head. And the main way that we seem to use this whole concept of consciousness is applying it to other people. We see it in other people. And it's kind of the root of all of our social interaction. So right now, you and I are talking to each other. We see a conscious mind in each other. Otherwise, the interaction becomes impossible.
Right.
And of course, it's really interesting online that you're just a bunch of pixels. But
Right.
I mean, well, I'm a bunch of pixels to you. You're pixels to me. And yet, I have these social networks in my brain that are busy building this whole construct of a human being and a conscious mind and projecting it onto those pixels. And I see you as a human being. And we do this all the time to each other. We live in this sea of perceived conscious minds. And so the mechanism of consciousness is, for humans at least, fundamentally a social mechanism. And it's not just about how does the brain build its own consciousness, but how does the brain see consciousness in others? How does it build consciousness that it projects onto others and everything all around us that allows us to interact? So you mentioned theory of mind. I just want to define that in case people out there are curious. Theory of mind concept's been around since the 70s, and it basically is the idea that we have intuitive theories that we build about the insides of other people's minds, like about what they want and what they're feeling and what their goals are. And so theory of mind is something we all do as social beings, and it's kind of at the heart of who we are as social animals. And at the heart of that, the very basis of that is recognizing when we're talking to something, interacting with something that has a mind, that has a conscious mind in it.
I recall your ventriloquist example as well, and how you to your son, I believe you do the puppet and it looks real. It's got a personality, and you want to attribute the consciousness to it in a similar sense.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I liked to use that. I would drag my ventriloquist orangutan puppet with me everywhere to my talks. And then he would sort of get up there and talk and argue with me. And that just to illustrate the point that, we're building these models of minds and projecting it onto the things around us. 'Cause, the puppet doesn't have a mind, but we all kind of perceive it. And we do that to each other. That's the whole point, is that, we're all ventriloquist puppets to each other. We all just see flappy mouths, hear noises, and then we attribute thoughts and beliefs and emotions to the people around us.
What percentage of that do you think, really is thoughts, beliefs, and emotions versus, as you said, like the flappy mouths, like what, because, it sounds like it's kind of going to the kind of extreme, well, not that it is extreme, but just towards kind of the absolute that, that's kind of what everything is we're just attributing consciousness to everything. Is not some of it valid for, like I know you cited, how interesting the octopus was, and even let's say like our pet dog who loves us very much, or at least we think, what is, would you say all of that in your theoretic perspective is just really the same mechanism at play, or is some of it valid if those beings also have this similar type of attention schema network?
Yeah, some of them do, right? I mean, just in the obvious case of people talking to each other, I always sort of feel like when two people talk to each other, there's four people present, right? There's me, there's you, there's a version of you that my brain constructed and just projected onto you, whether it's quite accurate or not. And then there's a version of me that you constructed and projected onto me. So we're doing that to each other all the time. The difference with a puppet is that only one of us is doing the constructing,
right?
And puppet
that
isn't.
Makes sense,
right? So you talk about a pet dog, yeah. The personality and emotion and mind in that dog that you see is a construct of your brain. It's your social machinery that built that. That doesn't mean it's invalid, because you're using cues and information you're getting from your dog. And your dog is doing the same thing back to you. Like, it has social machinery. It does build models of minds. It sees itself effectively as a conscious being, even if it doesn't have the verbal constructs. And it sees you as a conscious being too. And I guarantee you that the mind that the dog thinks you have is not really the same as the mind you actually have.
That makes sense. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I'm curious, just on a side note, do you have a sort of an idea of which organisms out there have this type of network, and which ones out of your definition that you could perhaps attribute some level of consciousness to? Because I know you were mentioning evolutionarily, it's really when the attention schema network showed up, and kind of from that evolutionary tree. Is that kind of from those branches forward where you would attribute consciousness?
So yes, if this whole theoretical construct is right, then you can draw a fairly clean line around a bunch of, a part of that big branching tree and say these creatures definitely have this mechanism. And like I said, that includes all mammals, all birds, probably many reptiles. Outside of that, I don't know. It becomes much harder to tell, right? So there's the possibility of these same mechanisms evolving independently. There's a possibility of these mechanisms being present in some really incipient form that is not easily recognizable, but then gets elaborated further in some evolutionary branches, right? So we don't know. Could it be that there are some fish? I don't know. It seems unlikely to me, but it's possible. And you mentioned octopuses. This is a wonderful example. They're so alien that I think nobody knows, right? Nobody knows what kind of attention mechanisms in the brain of an octopus exist. Nobody knows if they have any of that. Nobody knows if they have self-models that tell them that they have conscious experiences. I mean, it's clear they're super smart.
Yeah.
But it's not clear that they have this consciousness intuition about themselves. But what is clear is that they got big eyes and they look cute, and people who study them and interact with them have their own social machinery working overtime, projecting consciousness onto them. And so people look at them and say, they gotta be conscious. So that certainly happens. But what's happening inside the octopus brain is really not clear. So it's possible, of course. But what I can do based on the theory is point to certain types of animals and say they definitely have it.
So what accounts for the trickiness between species? Why are we more fooled by an octopus's consciousness than, let's say an ant? What's behind that, the gradient of how much we are sort of enchanted, into that creature?
Yeah. So actually it turns out there's a lot of interesting work on anthropomorphism, on the tendency of people to attribute mind to things. So one aspect is just visual appearance. Turns out to be one of the biggest factors that influence. So if you have something with eyeballs, then you're way more likely to think that it has a mind. And this works, it's automatic. Like across the board, people are like this. An ant just looks like a little wiry thing that, you have to get really close before you see the eyeballs. So octopuses just look more like people because they have heads with eyeballs on them. A second kind of set of factors is complex behavior, right? That's sort of obvious. If you see something behaving in a very complex way, but that's tricky because, self-driving cars are really complicated. In fact, their brains are more sophisticated than probably any insect brain out there. But they don't have those consciousness mechanisms in them. They're not like self-driving cars are not consciousness, but you can imagine somebody getting that false intuition, right? So I think it's really easy to attribute mind to things that have big eyeballs, that act complicated, that solve problems, that do things as they act more like humans. We start to humanize them more. And that's on us. Like what they actually have inside of them is a separate question. I'm not saying octopuses are just machines and we're all fools for thinking otherwise. I mean, they may have all those wonderful mechanisms. All I'm saying is when people talk about octopus consciousness and minds, all of that thus far is on us. It's our social imagination going into overdrive. I don't think there's good evidence or understanding of the actual octopuses yet.
Sure. I think it's a good segue too into the kind of experiment you mentioned in the book, which was, I guess, a theoretical one of an AI that tracked a person that would walk into a room with nothing more than, a microphone and a camera, and it would basically be looking to predict their behavior, kind of getting onto this sort of social cognition aspect that could kind of really get a model down to a T of human behavior. And so my question is, that kind of makes it out to be like we are almost like automatons in a way. And I'm not saying that necessarily even a negative connotation, just really that we are capable of being predicted to a extremely high fidelity. And I'm curious your thoughts of like where free will enters this, because kind of a little side thought experiment is, let's say there is someone that is walking into this room who is a compulsive overeater. Like, let's say they're overweight, and they have certain tendencies, and add the heuristic, they haven't eaten in 8 hours, right? And they walk in and, the donut's under the spotlight, and your model's going to say they have, a 90% chance eating the donut. And then you use, I think it was some Bayesian statistics, and now they're looking at the donut. And now it's like 99% chance to eat the donut, right? But that person, with the agency that we have, for whatever reason in that moment decides to make a lifestyle change and say, you know what, I'm sick of being overweight. I'm sick of feeling this way. I'm not eating this donut. I'm going to go on a diet, lose weight, and change my ways. When that statistical probability was a 99% accuracy. I know it's a little bit of a silly example, but I'm just wondering where free will wedges into that, because I feel like that free will is the sort of linchpin in us being 100% predictable. What are your thoughts on that just general thought process? And what are your thoughts on free will even?
Right. Well, I certainly don't think we're 100% predictable. I think even if you had a very sophisticated machine learning algorithm that had good cameras on us, I don't think it would predict our behavior 100%. I think that's probably really hard to do. I think people evolved to be good at that with respect to each other. I mean, that's the whole point of having social machinery. The whole point of theory of mind is to have good algorithms for predicting someone else's behavior so you can interact and bounce off in a better way. And even at that, our predictability after, millions of years of evolution, our prediction machinery doesn't work that great. Like, is better than chance, way better, which is why it's so effective for us. But people are not anywhere near, maybe we're 60% predictable. I don't know. But we're not super predictable. So there's a lot of weird, chaotic, stochastic junk going on in the brain that can
Sure.
it can lead to all kinds of different decisions under different circumstances. And you can run exactly the same scenario with the same person 100 times, and you'll find them only 80% of the time they do the one thing, and then they're still doing something weird the other 20%. So I absolutely believe that that's the case. That's one side of the question, is how predictable. It's very important that we are predictable, because if we're not, then we have no social glue at all. Because that's social cognition, social understanding is 100% about predicting each other and predicting our own behavior. Because if you can't predict your own behavior, again, you have no control. You have no way of strategizing. I'm going to do this so that I make sure I don't do that, and then it'll help me do that. If you're not predictable, all that goes out the window. So very important. Predictability, very important. Never 100%, never even close to 100% because of stochastic chaos in the brain. But now you have this separate question of free will. And I'm not a huge fan of the whole philosophical argument over free will, because I find I don't understand it. So if the question is, do we have a magical essence that sits outside of the physical universe and is not subject to the laws of any physics, that can come in like a puppeteer and make us do something so that no consideration of physics could ever have known about it, because the decision itself is made by magic outside of the realm of physics? If that's what you mean by free will, I'm pretty sure it does not exist. All right. But
Right.
if what you mean by free will is that processes in the brain make decisions about what the body should do next, and those processes are a little bit chaotic so that they're not 100% predictable, if that's what you mean by free will, then I would say, yeah, obviously, that's exactly right. That's what free will is. And so I don't know whether to say yes, it exists, or no, it doesn't. It depends on what you mean by it.
I feel very similarly. I feel I've always I ask the question because I think it's always great to get, leading experts' perspectives on it. But I'm in a similar school of thought. It's almost use your own discernment. Is there some force compelling you not to act in the way that you want in this very moment? I think free will is pretty self-evident. But I think a little bit of a layer below that on the nuance side, forget the prior example you mentioned. I think we both can discard that. But, from the brain activity is, inducing certain behaviors and actions and all of that, where does that, what is the impetus of that brain activity? Is it purely brain activity, or what's the will behind that brain activity? If you can see what I'm saying there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's all brain activity. Some of the brain activity is just in the motor system and it's making the muscles move. Some of the brain activity is in deeper layers, coming up with these deeper conceptual constructs and decisions that send signals forward into your motor system. So maybe you could say that the will lies in certain deeper layers in the brain, but it's all neural activity. I mean, that's what it is. It's information processing. It's neurons manipulating, altering, and sending signals. So it's computational. I
Sure.
guess you could say I'm a computationalist.
Understood. But not a response stimulaiist, if you will, right? Because I remember you saying in the book that you're not and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're not in the school of thought where we're just getting stimuli and responding, and we're just kind of automatons in that way, that there is this level of cognition happening,
Yeah.
right? So there is a nuance to that, correct?
Yeah, of course. Right. I mean, I think there are contrarians who love the idea that we don't make decisions, that the external world, the stimuli impose certain things on us and then we react, and that we have some kind of weird imaginative cognition that makes up a story that tells us after the fact, oh, I did that because of this, and I just chose that because of that, but it's all made up, and really we did this because the stimulus poked us. We made that decision because we had to. We were forced to by unconscious factors. Like there's a contrarian point of view that has had a big presence in psychology. And I think that it's not 100% wrong, because there are definitely cases when people are prompted to do things by circumstance and stimulus. And then after they do those things, they confabulate a reason and they believe the reason. And then they say, I did it because I made a deep decision in my conscious will. And yet what they're saying is false. Like, that does happen. It's a well-known phenomenon, but that isn't everything. That's only a tiny fraction, actually. There really is complicated, deep layers computing stuff all the time in your brain that has a giant influence on your decisions and your behavior. So it's absolutely 100% crystal clear. We are not just stimulus response machines that are forever driven by the environment right in front of us. So all this high level cognition is doing something that's actually modifying our behavior. And so in that sense, yeah, we got will, we got free will, but it's not ever independent of computation and neuronal processing. I mean, that's all we got in there.
Yeah, I think your theory is a really beautiful balance of that, because I think a lot of sort of more mechanistic type of theories will kind of go to the extreme, like you're saying. It's a product of complexity. There's this kind of the slippery slope aspect, and we're response stimuli response machines. And I think your theory kind of strikes a really nice balance in that way through those nuances. So that's really cool. Now, one of the other things I wanted to probe into, which is always a fun topic of conversation, is the philosophical zombie. Because I know you covered that in the book as well when you talked about hemispatial neglect. If you could just really quickly give the audience kind of some background on, number one, kind of the philosophical zombie idea and the hemispatial neglect, and then we can kind of move forward from there.
Right. So the philosophical zombie idea was a way to conceptually clarify what consciousness is. And the thought experiment was, imagine you had a person who was in every way just like a normal person, reacted to stimuli the same way, spoke the same way, acted the same way, and you could never tell the difference. But even though they're processing information apparently in similar ways, they don't have the subjective feeling. So they don't have consciousness of what they're doing. But they behave the same way, so externally it seems exactly the same. And the point of the philosophical zombie thought experiment is like so much of what I consider to be poor philosophy. Apologies to the people who love the philosophical zombie. It's an example of poor philosophy because it asks you to imagine something that is counterfactual. And then once you imagine it, it says, aha, because of that, therefore, subjective experience is different from all the computations. And of course, my response would be, okay, show it to me. Like, actually do that. Come up with that. Build that
Make
thing.
a Frankenstein. Yeah.
And then we can talk. But I don't think you can do that because I don't think that's possible. And so that's the philosophical zombie. And can you have a person, in attention schema theory, philosophical zombies are impossible for people, at least, the way the human brain is organized, because the consciousness thing is part of the machine that helps regulate and control your attention. And so if you take the consciousness thing away, then attention no longer works right. And if attention doesn't work right, nothing works right. And the example of that is sort of the most obvious example is the hemispatial neglect example, which you mentioned. And so there are people who have damage to a particular part of the brain, usually on the right hemisphere, that wipes out their conscious experience of everything on the left side of space. It's just a completely weird
That's wild.
syndrome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Totally nutty, but that's what happens. So they lose their conscious experience, everything on the left side of space. They still can pay attention, and there's a subtlety that is often lost even in the literature. It is possible for their brains to focus their processing on things on the left side of space. They just aren't consciously aware of it. So they have attention, they just don't have consciousness of it. And you end up with people who do not respond or respond very weakly to things on the left side. They can't regulate their attention. Their attention may get yanked a little bit here and there, but they can't regulate, can't control it. They can't act in an intentional way toward things on the left side of space because they've lost that mechanism, that awareness mechanism, that attention schema mechanism is gone for the left side of space. And it shows what happens. It is not true that a philosophical zombie, if you could suck out just the awareness part, that the person would go on and be normal and act normal, right? This would be a person who would be a vegetable. So if you, instead of hemispatial neglect, if you had total neglect, no conscious experience of anything, then you have somebody who's not reacting to anything, not able to behave in any complex or meaningful way. You'd have a vegetable. So that's kind of the link between the philosophical zombie concept, hemispatial neglect, and consciousness or awareness.
Very interesting. To provide kind of a buffer, sort of counter perspective, kind of on the spiritual side, to kind of see where this theory lies in that is, back to the observer concept. And I think a good analogy to use here is imagine Tony Stark with his suit, right? He's flying through the air, gets hit by a rocket, and his sensors on the left side of his suit get blown up, but he's still there and he's still conscious and he's still Tony Stark and doing his thing, but he just has lost access to that part of his machinery.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that in the sense of the consciousness itself has just lost the connection to that, but that person who has the hemispatial neglect still has goals, dreams, love, all of these different attributes that we associate with consciousness, but it's just disconnected from the hardware, if you will.
Yeah, I think that, again, there's a distinction between the things you are conscious of and the mechanism of being conscious of them. And so one of the examples I give is, the bucket and the items in the bucket. The things you're conscious of are like the items in the bucket, and consciousness is the bucket. And so you can try really hard to explain all the little items in the bucket. That's not the same thing as a theory of consciousness itself, which is a theory of the bucket itself. So I think this person who's got hemispatial neglect has lost the ability to apply the consciousness machinery to things on the left side of space. Those things are no longer in the consciousness bucket. They can't go in there anymore. But it is different. Your Tony Stark example is actually really different. Because there you're talking about cutting off sensory input. And the hemispatial neglect is not a loss of sensory input. Actually, the sensory input's all there. It's still coming in. It's a loss of consciousness of everything to the left side. And it is weird. So, for example, people eat food on one side of the plate and they think they're done because it never occurs to them that there even is another side of the plate because they're not aware of it. And until you rotate the plate so if the missing food appears on the good side, they can't conceive of it. And then they don't know where that extra food came from. Right? Or a classic example of memory. Put someone in, sit someone in a chair, say, okay, close your eyes, imagine you're in your bedroom, standing at the door, looking in, describe everything in your room. And they describe all the furniture on one side and stop. And it never occurs to them that they forgot the other side of the room. And then you tell them, okay, now imagine you're standing at the window looking back at the door, describe your room, and they close their eyes and imagine it, and they describe the opposite set of furniture. And again, it doesn't occur to them that they've missed half the room because they're not aware of it. And if you're not aware of it, why would you even notice that it's not there? Right? So, losing sensory input, I would, to give an example that we're all familiar with, we have no vision behind our heads, but we're still aware that there's stuff back there. We can remember it. We can talk about it. We can guess what might be back there. We can think about it. So just lacking sensory input is not the same thing as erasing it from your consciousness. And hemispatial neglect is this weird syndrome where the mechanism of becoming conscious of things becomes cut off from the sensory processing mechanisms on this side of space. So it's a weird kind of syndrome.
Yeah, that's almost hard to even fathom,
Yeah.
From one entire side of your existence. So yeah, that's absolutely wild.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that's right. There's a lot of these things that are very hard to fathom because it's really easy to forget that the brain constructs reality. And so whatever that brain is constructing for that particular person, that's their reality.
Right. And I think this is an interesting point too, kind of segueing from that is in your section about uploading the mind. That was an absolute mind-bending roller coaster, going through kind of your vision, of what would be necessary and how long it would take and what reality and civilization, would look like on perhaps the other side of that. And a couple things, I was curious about just philosophically on that end is, do you really believe that, uploading just neuronal pathways, synapses, and those types of things in absolute perfect fidelity is enough, in terms of consciousness is, quite embodied in the sense that even our hearts have their own central, cardiac nervous system, and we get so much knowledge from our physical experience. Is there is just neuronal pathways and synapses, of course, barring some further complexity, enough to just actually copy a consciousness?
Well, so the embodiment question is really interesting. I think it's important, but I think if you get your arm cut off, you're still a conscious being. If I think you get both arms and both legs removed, you're still a conscious being. I think if you had some terrible accident where your torso was cut off halfway, as happens to some people, arms, legs, half a torso, you're still a conscious being, or different. Like as your body changes, all the inputs change, and your perspective on the world, especially your emotional perspective, is gonna change. Like it's really important, but you're still a conscious being. I think if you had just a head, and that hasn't been done yet on people, thank goodness, but if you had just a head that was kept alive with like blood pumping up through the veins or something, or the arteries, you'd still have consciousness, right? So, I think, yes, the brain is the key. The brain and how it's handling information, it is fundamentally about that. On the other hand, and I think you alluded to this, is it just neuronal pathways? I suspect the answer is no. I suspect there's more going on in the brain than just which neuron is connected to which other neuron. I suspect there's things going on in there that aren't yet well understood. And after all, neurons make up only about 1/10 or less of the cells in the brain. There's a lot of other stuff going on. Glia cells are the big topic on that end. And so I suspect probably if you copied a brain with perfect fidelity, just the neurons and their connections, that you would probably have something that's very impoverished that doesn't really quite work. That's my guess. But it's a place to start. I mean, not that you want to be an early adopter of that kind of, like, you don't want to be the dude who wakes up with just the neurons and be like, oh my God, this existence is awful. But certainly the brain is the key.
Sure. Man, that's so interesting. Yeah, definitely something to, ponder for sure. I'm curious as well. Microtubules. Do you spend any time in microtubules? And I know like there's Penrose and Hameroff talk about, quantum collapse and all of this stuff. I just throw that at you. What's kind of your take on microtubules in that bigger picture?
I mean, from the point of view of a neuroscientist, it's complete nonsense. It's like
interesting,
literally the definition of pseudoscience.
Wow.
So I understand that that these people have made contributions in other areas, especially the physics of black holes. But no, there are microtubules, like they do exist. There's all kinds of structures in cells that do exist, and when you get down to very small structures, quantum effects become prominent. Like that's true, but none of that has anything to do with any of what they're talking about.
Interesting. And just to get further clarity too on that, is what would you say is some of the main issues with it? Is it just fundamentally as a structure, or are there any nuances too that you would disagree with?
I mean, I don't think we need to get into the nuances. I think it's basically, it's just total nonsense. Sorry, but that's not the level at which, bits of information are being processed in the brain, or any of the things that we think we know internally or introspectively that does not emerge. You don't need, if you could build neurons, artificial neurons, that didn't have microtubules but still functioned the same way, they'd be fine.
So what functions, just for the layman, what functions do microtubules serve?
There's all kinds of microstructure within a cell, right? And so there's transport of material around a cell. The chemistry of the cell has to get transported, especially in a neuron, because neurons have a cell body and then they have these long processes that stick out of them to connect to other neurons. And so something's got to transport neurotransmitters or precursors of neurotransmitters or proteins or this or that has to get transported through the cell. So that's one of the main roles of these kinds of microstructures. And there's lots of other roles like that. And they're all really important from a biological point of view. But this obsession with them is, there's something so extraordinarily stupid about it.
What do you think, given that perspective, what do you think for people who are very accomplished, scientists in their respective disciplines, what's so attractive about that? Because obviously they'll write very extensive books and have, lots of papers and research. Yeah. And it's like, where's the impetus there then?
I don't know. These things crop up all the time if you look over the centuries, right? There are supposedly books and books on how many angels dance on the head of a pin. That's basically what this is. I don't know why. I don't know where this stuff comes from.
Just curious from an actual neuroscientist in the community, it's always interesting to hear your perspective from the inner world.
Right. Yeah. I don't know why it depends a lot on personality. There's a certain cult of personality that tends to grow these ideas. But no.
Sure. Simple enough.
Yeah.
Got it. Well, I guess to kind of wrap up here, and I feel like I may know your answer to this question, but I just like to ask everyone because you never know. Some people have inner philosophies that, outside of their scientific disciplines. I was curious just to wrap up on just the concept of God. And again, I think I probably can ascertain, a good bit of your answer, but I'm just curious, something that always fascinates me is just how complex and how unbelievable living systems are, let alone our universe. Good God. Literally, but it just baffles me that there is just a chance that as a neuron can come into existence. Like what, reality could very well have just said, screw it, I'm not going to make a neuron, right? Like why is there some force, it feels like, that's pushing for greater and greater levels of intelligence and complexity? Because it very well doesn't have to be that way, and that's some things that I kind of ponder and introspect as some main stakes I put in that thought process is where is the blueprint for a neuron? Is it really just like a mutation here and there over a long period of time? And now we have this biological information technology system that's like, we can barely replicate nowadays in terms of like the neural networks, but I don't want to digress too much, but your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah. So a lot of what you're talking about, I think, is it's a perspective grounded in the human, social, intuitive way of understanding the universe. So we evolved to look at really complicated things and try to figure out what their motivations were and why they chose this and what their mind state is. That's how we evolved, right? So we have that in us. We naturally look at things like the complexity of life and we start with an assumption. My God, something built it, right? Because that's the social cognition approach to the universe, to look at complexities, look at anything. So you're somebody hanging out, 5,000 years ago and lightning hits the tree behind your house and your brain is built and you lack the, scientific structure around that. So you look at that and say something wanted that to happen. Like something intentionally did it. Why? Because that's how we evolved. We evolved to see intentionality. We evolved to see motivation behind things. Because if we didn't have that in us, then we wouldn't understand each other and we wouldn't have social interactions. We wouldn't be the cooperative species, successful species we are. So we evolved to have the kind of perspective that you're putting forward right now, which is to ask these questions. Who wanted it that way? who designed it that way, who intended it to be that way. But these are theory of mind questions. And the mind that you're attributing and projecting out there is some kind of big cosmic mind. But if you can escape for a moment from the social cognition perspective and try to get into a kind of a somewhat uncomfortable perspective of the scientist who's trying to strip away all the preconceptions, you might ask yourself, first of all, why does complexity imply something built it? Like, if something built it, then what built how did that thing get so complicated? Well, maybe there's other ways that complexity emerges. That's not an intentional being made it happen. And we know there are. We know there's tons of ways that complexity can happen. So that's one major thought, I would say, is that a lot of the impetus for the questions you're asking, understand that these come from a theory of mind perspective, which is baked into the human brain to see the world in that way, and baked in by evolution. So the second thing I would say is don't mistake the time scales and the space scales. So a neuron is an astonishing thing. It had 3.5 billion years to evolve. Like, that's a freaking long time.
Yeah, pretty long.
And then they seem to appear maybe 500 million years ago, roughly. Okay. So there's, even 500 million years is an unimaginably long time period. And it's really hard, even when we try to wrap our minds around the timescales and the little tweaks that can happen, year by year, decade by decade. And then, we know, for example, that little changes, like we all saw COVID evolve. In just month by month, it was evolving because of little tweaks to the machinery of COVID, little tweaks to the DNA. Well, you build that up, not just over the months and year or two before COVID fizzed out. You build it up over 3.5 billion years. And who knows what you get at the end of that, right? And so there's a wonderful, totally speculative but interesting account of neurons that they're modified muscle cells. And so muscles have to contract, but the contraction has to be coordinated. And so they evolve basically ways of spreading signal. All muscles work this way. They're electrical. And when there's an impulse that is triggered at one end, all the cells that are connected start contracting. The electrical impulse spreads all the way across the muscle, cell by cell. And now imagine you have a muscle cell with a mutation that takes away its ability to contract. And so it's basically a broken muscle cell, but it still has this ability to transmit the electrical signal from one end to the other. Now all you have, instead of a broken muscle cell, is the beginning of information transfer and information processing, just because of a mutation. And so, then we have nervous systems and brains evolving basically as these little broken muscle cells that lost the ability to contract, but still send signals from one end to the other. And so we're all just meatheads, so to speak.
Those are definitely very, very strong and profound perspectives to ponder. I think the time arc is definitely a good one to factor in, of like really fathoming, or attempting to those arcs of time and these mutations and the other aspects you mentioned as well. But no, Michael, this has been an absolute pleasure, and I really appreciate you lending all of your expertise and insights. I feel like I've definitely expanded my consciousness, my knowledge through this experience, and I know our audience did as well. But I'd love just to wrap things up here real quickly by, if you want to take a quick second to let everyone know where they can find you. I will link all of your books and all of your work as well in the description. But if you want to take just a quick second, if there are any other links or places you want people to go find you.
I would say just look me up on Google. I'm there. Michael Graziano, Princeton University. I have a bunch of things you can check out. I have obviously a lot of science books, I also have some hopefully interesting music on YouTube and other things. I have some fiction books, so check it all out.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Michael. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
All right, you take care.
All
Bye-bye
right.
now.
Bye now.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Quantum Theory Podcast. If you desire to embark on the path of self-mastery, visit quantumtheorypodcast.com to join a like-minded community of purpose seekers committed to personal growth.